Hi there, this is Patty Minch. Today I'm going to be looking at 3 different resources that I use with students and analyzing how well they align to the UDL guidelines and how I can adapt them to better support learners with special needs. The first we're going to look at is a note-taking device for students made with Google Docs. The second is the PowerPoint that accompanies those notes, and then finally is going to be a separate program called Nearpod, and I'd like to look to see how well that meets some of these principles for universal design learning. So taking a look at the first one, these are the notes for a lesson on weathering, erosion, and deposition. Now I know that because it's written up here at the top, however nowhere on the actual document itself does it say that that's what these notes are for. So the first change would be to not just properly format the headings, but actually put a heading on this page. There are directions, however, all the directions really tell you are to complete the notes. So that does not really help out too much at all. The table itself is pretty poorly formatted. If we take a look at the Online Accessibility Handbook, we can see an example of a table here is much more visually appealing. It's much more organized than the one on my note-taking document. Furthermore, there aren't any instructions on how to have students fill out this document. So if a student was looking at this for the first time, you are assuming that they know your expectations for that. So I definitely add some either alternative text for the table or just have directions right above it that explain what to do with it. There are headings, however, they're not properly formatted, and again, the overall organization of this table is pretty poor. There's not much contrast between the headings and what is already given to them and what they need to fill out. So I don't think that an automated speech or an automated reader would read this in a way that would help students understand the role of it and the organization of this chart. You could give a really loose argument for student choice and engagement by having them choose different images that support the definitions or the geologic features that the different deposition creates, but I think that would be a little bit of a stretch. So I would definitely use this as a non-example as opposed to an example. So let's take a look at the PowerPoint that accompanies this and look at a little bit better of an example, but still a lot of areas for improvement. To start off, it does have a heading. It is a properly formatted heading. One thing that I always stress with my students is that if you're going to put text over an image to make sure that the background image is a high enough contrast that you can read the writing. One way to improve upon this would be to put a block behind it of a solid color. But overall, I think that this is enough contrast that it's easy to read. Both within our books and within one of the other resources, it mentions using appropriate color and contrasting colors. However, I didn't see anywhere that actually specifically told us what those colors were. I think it's supposed to be our own judgment. However, I did go onto the National Eye Institute website and looked into color blindness a little bit, and the most prevalent one is red-green. And looking at this, I think that red text is especially straining on the eyes, and within this presentation I do have some red text, so that would be one thing that I would adapt. It is in a contrasted part of the picture, so that helps a little bit, but as I mentioned before, I would probably put a solid block behind it to help it stand out a little bit better and maybe just change the color altogether. As we move through, the slides do have properly formatted headings, so if a student was using this as an automated reader, I think the computer would read it correctly. There's not too much on this slide to read or to misread, but I think that the headings are formatted in a way that would help out. The image does not have any alt text, so I would definitely go through and add that, especially with an explanation. Same with this. It's formatted correctly, it just doesn't have any alt text. I want to jump down to this slide and point out a few things. Like I mentioned before, red is one of the more difficult colors to read. It just tends to strain the eyes a little bit. Also in our book, it mentioned not only using color to depict meaning. So you'll notice that I'm using red here to identify that this is a definition that they need to know, and you'll see it on a different slide as well. However, if a student is colorblind, they can't tell that this is red, and so I need to identify in an additional way that this is something that stands out, whether it's by changing the bullet to a star or italicizing it or underlining it or whatever it might be. I need to identify in more than one way that this should stand out to them. Taking a look at the link, if we take a look back at the online accessibility and scroll down a little bit to how to make accessible PowerPoints, it says here that the link should be meaningful and describes its destination. However, if you take a look at this PowerPoint, it does not do that. So I could change this so that the link would say something like, click here to see how the grand canyon was formed, or something like that. So it gives students an idea of what that link is leading them to. And then again, adding some alt text to this image. I don't have any problem with this being down here. I think this is just more of a citation, so it's not necessarily for students to be reading. However, if a student was clicking on the text-to-speech, it would read this, and so I'm not sure if a student would understand the purpose of that. So maybe to add something like, I got this video from, and then having the link might help them to understand why that's there. Looking further on here, as I mentioned before, adding some other indicator that this is something I want them to be writing down. One thing I was unsure of: this image is taken off of a website, and so I don't think that the text-to-speech reader would actually read this. It wouldn't read decreasing velocity of stream flow because it just sees this as a picture. And so that's one thing to be mindful of as you're adding alternative text to explain what's in the picture, and then also describing the text that's within a picture that the text-to-speech reader wouldn't pick up on. One thing that also stood out for me is just being consistent throughout the PowerPoint. So if I am having the red depicting that this is a definition, I was not consistent with it. So on slides 5 and 7, I have erosion and deposition, but then if you scroll down to slide 10, this is a definition for groundwater that they need to know. However, it's not in red and it's not identified. So just to be consistent with those things. As we move forward, there's a lot of images, which does increase engagement. It helps to make it a little bit more relevant, especially in science, to see pictures of things that they may not have seen before. However, there does need to be some alternative text to describe exactly what it is that they're looking at. So overall, this is a better example of universally designed learning, especially when compared to the Google Docs. However, there are a ton of things that could go into this presentation to make it a lot more engaging and a lot more supportive to the needs of special needs students. The last thing that I did want to look at is a program called Nearpod, and if you're not familiar with it, Nearpod is a free online program where it has free elements to it where you can upload PowerPoints like the one that I just showed and add interactive elements to it. And this came to mind as I was looking at some of the principles for UDL, and I wanted to get your feedback as to how you could use this and how it does improve the support of learners with special needs and how it aligns to some of the guidelines. So on the left-hand side here, this is what the teacher would see, and then on the right-hand side, I have what the student would see. Now, you can set this up in a synchronous way where the teacher's in control of the slides, and then the students would go through the slides at the same pace, or you could have it set up as an asynchronous model where the students go at their own pace, and within that, there would need to be some additions made to make it a little bit more user-friendly in terms of having speech to text, and I'll look at that in a little bit. So the student would join the session, and as the teacher is clicking through, this is what I would have on the screen. The students are going through the same slides. So it's much like having a PowerPoint, but it makes it a little bit more interactive, and I'll show you some of those interactive tools that, in my opinion, increase the availability for teachers to add elements of universally designed learning. So as I'm clicking through, one shortcoming that I did notice is that I don't think that the text-to-speech would work on this because it's not a PowerPoint itself. One thing that we could do if it was an asynchronous model is I could add an audio feature to this where I'm reading this out loud. That kind of, there's a little bit of a loophole to that. But what this does, and one of the reasons I wanted to show you, is because it definitely increases engagement, which is the third principle. It has multiple means of representing things. I'm just going to go through the three principles in order. But there are audio, there are visual, there are all sorts of different ways that students are going to interact with this. So the first one is a virtual field trip, which you can put into a PowerPoint presentation, and they can look at this and really engage in some great conversation around it. So that extends kind of the multimedia piece. Additionally, if I skip over to the multiple means of engagement, both in our book on page 226, excuse me, on page 225, it talks about having various methods of response and navigation. So with this, students can draw their answers, they can circle their answers, or here you can see they can add text. And one of the elements of engagement that Rice mentions is ensuring that teachers are able to monitor their students as they're working and track their progress. So as I flip through this, the students are flipping through it as well. There's another virtual field trip. And again, this would be accompanied with different discussions and questions and having students giving their own feedback. If I was doing this in an asynchronous model, I would preview with a slide before that would ask those questions and say, on the next slide, you're going to go to a virtual field trip where you're going to see the Milky Way galaxy. Tell me what you think, or maybe ask some probing questions before they go to this. Here we start to see some of the different ways that students can interact with this. And again, you can tell pretty clearly that this is just a PowerPoint presentation that was uploaded into this program. On this slide, on the teacher slide, you can keep track of all the student responses, and you'd be able to see them here. I only have one student in here at the moment. But moving along with what I said in terms of various methods of response and navigation, students can draw, they can write and label things, and so it's just a matter of how you set it up, but it gives you more options as far as student engagement and having students giving multiple ways and various ways to respond and express their understanding of things. As I mentioned before, I'm unsure if assistive tools work within this website. I've been looking through it a little bit and going through some of the user guides and help sections for it, and I haven't seen anything of it that mentioned it. But within this, there are graduated levels of support and intervention that you can provide for students. You can show them interactive models like this one that you wouldn't be able to do on a PowerPoint, and that increases engagement and gives them a lot more to fall back on as far as background knowledge if you continue with this topic. And lastly here, I just wanted to show you another tool that they could use where in the previous slide I gave them the prompt, and then as they move on they would circle a specific type of galaxy that they see. So I just wanted to kind of present this up for discussion and see what you guys thought. Some of the needs of this program are seeing if it has some sort of assistive technology for students, or if they're on iPads, if that works as one of the accessibility tools. Furthermore, if this is an asynchronous model and I have students going through this on their own, I would just need to add the audio of myself reading this for students who are visually impaired that might need that read to them. The other option I can do is download this as a PowerPoint, and then students will be able to just read through it using the assistive technology that way as well. So let me know what you think. If there are any ways that you could imagine using this in a way that I didn't suggest, be sure to let me know.